All adjustments to the IT infrastructure are mapped via the change enablement process, in accordance with ITIL. The process of the same name in serviceware processes has 5 phases. During the submission phase, all information for the implementation of the change is first collected. Alternatively, the standard changes already available from the catalog of the same name can be accessed directly. The change then goes through the analysis and evaluation phase. If all the necessary information for the implementation of the change is available and a review has taken place with the involvement of the implementation team, the change can be submitted for authorization. Depending on the classification of the change, authorization is granted by different approval instances. The change coordinator documents the results. In the subsequent implementation phase, the actual realization, testing, and implementation of the change takes place. The different steps can be controlled by the change coordinator with tasks or subprocesses. If a review is appropriate after implementation, whether successful or unsuccessful, the change enters the review phase. The post-implementation review includes a subsequent assessment of the planning of resources, time, and budget, as well as a re-evaluation of the change result. The change is then completed and the process is finished. The data can be entered by any person from IT. This person is referred to as the applicant. It is responsible for discussing and sounding out the requirements of the new change with the business in advance. The requester is the link between the business units or specialist departments and IT. The applicant is therefore responsible for creating the change. This includes the detailed description and initial classification of the change, as well as the provision of all required information. If an IT employee starts a new change, the following dialog opens. In the header area of the dialog, some central process information is displayed in addition to the process progress indicator. It is also possible to select a change template in the header during submission. Change templates are pre-authorized standard changes according to ITIL. They represent a low risk for the IT infrastructure and can therefore be carried out at any time, without further coordination or approval by the change coordinator. When such a change template is selected, some fields are filled automatically and can no longer be changed. Once a standard change has been saved, it switches to the implementation phase immediately after being entered. In this context, the acceptance date and the date of approval are automatically set to the current date and time, and the approval instance and approval result are entered. Regardless of whether it is a standard, normal, or emergency change, an applicant must be selected during the submission process. To simplify this step, the recording agent is automatically entered as the applicant on the Created For tab. If desired, the pre-assignment of the applicant can be removed and replaced by selecting another person. After selecting the applicant, the notification field is filled with the selection from the person's master data and can be customized for the change if desired. If possible, the configuration item or service for which the change is being created should also be selected. This information is entered in the left-hand part of the dialog below the applicant. After selecting a configuration item, the detailed data for the selected CI is displayed in the field below. Which data is displayed there can be configured via the read view of the respective product object. The editing area of the dialog starts to the right of the entry of the applicant. The General tab is displayed first. The two large text fields for the description and reason for change are located on the left-hand side of the screen. Both are mandatory fields and must be filled in right from the start. To the right of the two text fields, there are various selection fields for classifying a change. Not all fields need to be filled in during submission. Therefore, only the mandatory fields are explained first. The correct category must be selected from the up to 3-level category tree for all ITSM processes. The selection of the category has an influence on the subsequent team selection. In addition, the change coordinator is also preset by selecting the category. If a change template has been selected, standard is pre-selected for the change type and cannot be changed. Otherwise, you can choose between normal and emergency. The selection of emergency does not initially change the further course of the process. It should only be used for the purpose of subsequent documentation of such an emergency change. As explained above, a team must be selected before saving for the first time. This is necessary because, among other things, the selected implementation team is responsible for processing the change, alongside the change coordinator. If the selection of the category does not result in a clear team selection, the appropriate team can be selected from the list of assigned teams at this point. As the change coordinator is responsible for the subsequent processing of the change, one must be selected right from the start. The selection list for the change coordinator always contains the available change coordinators in the system. To ensure that a suitable change coordinator can always be proposed with the help of the category selection, it is advisable to name and set up a change coordinator for each first-level process category. At the lower levels of the process categories, additional change coordinators can be set up as required to better cover a specific topic. On the Associated Changes tab, you can associate already known change processes that have a dependency on the current change. For example, higher-level change processes have an effect on your own change. If the requester wants to save their entries before proposing the change, they can do so at any time using the Save button in the dialog. As long as the change is not proposed or the standard change is not submitted for implementation, it always remains in the queue or on the work list of the registered applicant. The Next Phase button displayed in the header area can be used to initiate the further process flow, depending on the change type. If the recorded change is a normal or emergency change, the change can first be given to the selected change coordinator using the Next Phase button. The only nominal difference between a normal and an emergency change in the further course of the process is that the emergency change is usually always recorded and documented retrospectively. Otherwise, all processing steps are the same and are not differentiated in the further description. A change can also be started by process chaining from the problem or request process. The two main roles during the registration of the change are the applicant and the change coordinator. The change coordinator is derived from the process category, which must already be selected during data entry. As already explained, the applicant is responsible for preparing the change. These submitted contents are checked by the change coordinator, and if necessary, supplemented with the help of the applicant. Depending on the result of the review, the change moves on to the next phase, analysis and evaluation, or is terminated early. The change coordinator then checks whether all the information in the change is sufficient, or whether the applicant needs to make any additions. The change coordinator can initially decide whether to add the applicant's details to the process themselves, or send it back to them using the Previous Phase button. If the change coordinator discovers that the change is a duplicate, he can end the change process prematurely by clicking the Duplicate button in the dialog header. In this case, the change coordinator must select the change that was originally identified as the same change on the Processes tab before exiting. The change is then terminated automatically. To document the various processing steps, the change coordinator, like the applicant, can document the corresponding activities via the Activities tab. The individual activities carried out on this change are recorded here. You can also send emails via this tab in Change. The transition to the analysis and evaluation phase of the process takes place via the Next Phase button in the header area of the dialog. In this phase of the process, the change coordinator takes on the detailed classification of the change, draws up the necessary schedule, and coordinates the procedure and implementation steps with the specialist teams. Here, the change coordinator can also give tasks to other teams involved in order to obtain the required information. At the end of this phase, an agreed assessment of the change must be available, which enables the change to be subsequently authorized. On the Planning tab, the description fields are now filled in further or the previous details are refined. The fallback plan should describe the procedure and steps to be taken if errors or problems occur during implementation that result in a rollback. The better and more detailed the description is, the easier it will be to implement such a plan later on. In the risk and impact analysis, the change coordinator must enter the fundamental risk and the consequences if the change is not implemented as desired. This also depends on detailed data from the specialist departments for which the change is being created. In the best case, this information has already been sufficiently described by the applicant. In the implementation description, the implementation team must specify which steps must be carried out for the actual implementation. Here too, the activities should be listed in as much detail as possible so that the resulting risk can be assessed as accurately as possible. The test description describes test cases that must be carried out as part of the implementation of the change. At this point, reference can also be made to existing test catalogs or test concepts. If there are specifications regarding the involvement of the specialist departments for the tests, these must be taken into account in the description. Ultimately, the various specialist teams must provide the change coordinator with information on the effort and costs that will be incurred as a result of the implementation. These are documented in the cost estimation field. In addition to person days, this also includes details of any additional hardware or external services that need to be purchased. In the end, these should be summarized here so that they can be included in the decision during authorization. The Schedule and Tasks tab is available to the change coordinator to collate the above information and also to enter a schedule. The change coordinator can enter the schedule on this tab during the entire phase up to the end of the authorization and change it at any time. However, the selection fields in the current times group box are locked, with the exception of the input fields for analysis and evaluation. With the start of the implementation phase, the selection fields from the schedule group box are locked. Instead, it is now possible to enter the date and time information in the current times group box. For reasons of simplification, you can use the arrow buttons to transfer the planned values to the fields for the actual values at any time. Subsequent adjustment is then still possible. Below the two group boxes, it is possible to start individual tasks, task packages, or entire predefined subprocesses via task management. These can be used to request information from the specialist IT teams involved. For example, the change coordinator can ask the database team to provide a list of the steps required to back up the affected databases, as these must be carried out as part of the implementation. Before this phase can be completed by the change coordinator and the change awaits authorization, the change coordinator must carry out a final risk assessment or check and correct an original assessment if necessary. To do this, it will fill in the following selection fields on the General tab. The Impact on Service selection field describes the potential impact on the service of the desired change. Next, the coordinator can evaluate the test options that exist before the change can finally go live. The Fallback Procedure field is used to evaluate the existing fallback plan. When selecting complexity, coordination, dependencies, it is important to estimate how complex the change coordinator considers the change to be. What he thinks, how much coordination effort is involved, or how great the dependencies on other change processes or events are. The rating results from a mix of the various points. Therefore, a more abstract selection of low, medium, or high is offered here. The number of affected users should roughly indicate how many users are directly affected by the implementation of the change. The scales may have to be adapted to your own company. Based on the selection made in the various risk categories, a score is calculated that determines which risk category is automatically entered at the end. You can see the points per selection in the table displayed. After adding up the points based on the respective selection, the following matrix results for the selection of the risk category. The risk category is selected automatically and cannot be changed manually. The risk category is also used to pre-assign the approval authority for the subsequent authorization. This can also be upgraded if desired. In the event of an emergency change, emergency CAB is always entered as the approval authority, regardless of the underlying risk category. In order to complete the evaluation of the change, the documentation of the technical release is also necessary. This can be done in two ways. The first option allows the change coordinator to manually enter the result of the technical release on the Release tab. As a second option, the technical release can be carried out using an approval task in the system. The actual subprocess for obtaining technical approval can then be initiated via the Start Technical Approval checkbox. The recipients of this approval task are all members of the previously selected implementation team. These are automatically associated with the process in advance. The list of persons can be viewed in the table below the Technical Approval group box. The change coordinator can add to the list of people if other specialist teams are also involved in the coordination. It is then sufficient for one of the team members to accept or reject the approval task. The result of the decision is then entered in the Release Result field, and the decision date is also filled in. The text of a possible rejection is entered in the Reason field on the tab. The internal status of the change is set to be checked, so that the change coordinator takes note of the completion of the approval task. In the event that the change is technically approved by the implementation team, the change coordinator can now click on the Next Phase button to transfer the change to the authorization phase. After clicking, the process is automatically saved and released. In the event that the change is not approved, the change coordinator can decide on the basis of the reason for rejection, whether the change and its evaluation need to be revised and adjusted again, or whether the change process should be terminated early. In the authorization phase, the change is either authorized automatically or by the respective committee, depending on the change type. In addition to the change type, its risk category also plays a role here. In the end, the change coordinator records the decision on behalf of the respective committee. The change is then continued in the implementation phase, or the change is terminated early. The change coordinator must document the results of the approval in the change via the Authorization tab. The Technical Release group box is also displayed on this tab, but is deactivated. The table for the members of the implementation team is no longer displayed at this point. As can already be seen from the BPMN for this phase, the respective approval instance is pre-assigned on the basis of the change type, in conjunction with the risk category. You can see the default settings in the table. The approval authority can also be upgraded at any time. For example, from Change Coordinator to Change Advisory Board. If it is already clear in advance from the combination of risk category and change type that the CAB is responsible for approval, the members of the CAB can be read from the appropriate configuration element for the change process and associated with the change. The members of the CAB are then displayed in the Meeting Participants table. The change coordinator can adjust the list of people in this phase at any time to accommodate short-term changes in the CAB's composition. The meeting minutes text field must be used to record what was discussed in the joint meeting with regard to the change. These can be, for example, restrictions or conditions under which the change is released for implementation. The approval result and the date of the decision must also be entered at the end, otherwise it will not be possible to move on to the next phase of the change. Once the change has been accepted and the result has been documented by the change coordinator, the change can be submitted for implementation using the Next Phase button. In this phase, the change coordinator takes over the entire management, from realization and testing to the implementation of the change. He can use tasks, task packages, and predefined subprocesses for this purpose. Once implementation is complete, the change is either continued in the review phase or terminated immediately, depending on the results. The change coordinator now has the task of assigning the various teams with the realization of the change and coordinating and monitoring compliance with the schedule and the defined results. To do this, he can start and monitor any tasks, task packages, or subprocesses on the Schedule and Tasks tab. He can also document the current times for the various phases there. Changes on the General, Documentation, and Authorization tabs are no longer possible in this phase. Once all tasks have been completed, the change coordinator can decide on the further course of the process. Various options are available in the form of buttons. If he clicks the Next Phase button, the review is run through. This must be run through if the change could not be implemented successfully. The same applies if the change is to be proposed as a standard change. If the change is successfully implemented, this phase can be completed. This can be useful in the event of a major change, as the empirical values are reflected on and recorded once again. In the case of a standard change, the button is not displayed and the change can only be ended directly using the Complete button. If the change has been successfully executed and no further activities are required, the change can be completed directly by clicking the Complete button. The change is then marked as successfully implemented. If the change coordinator clicks the Defer button, the change switches to the Waiting For status and remains in this phase. This can be used if the change is no longer to be implemented for current reasons. Work on the change can then be continued at any later date. If the change has not been successfully implemented, or if the change coordinator decides to carry out a post-implementation review for any other reason, the change will go through this phase. As before, the change coordinator takes on all the necessary activities to complete the required steps. In addition to convening a meeting with the people involved in the change, he also documents the results of the review. He can also assign specific tasks in this phase with the help of task management. At the end of the review, some information on the results of the review must be entered on the Review tab in Change. First, a summary of the points discussed in the meeting should be recorded in the Review Minutes field. The problems with the change discussed in the review and the resulting measures should be described. However, mention should also be made of the points that went well and that need to be maintained. If it turns out in retrospect that certain risks were not considered in advance but had a negative effect on the change, these should be described separately in the Unforeseen Risks field. In this way, you will be able to draw on this experience when a similar change occurs. In addition to the above descriptions, the questions on the right must also be completed and answered. If the change has been successfully implemented, the change coordinator has the option of proposing the change as a standard change, and thus marking it for later evaluation or further utilization. For this purpose, a change template can be created directly or at a later time from the change, which can be included in the catalog for standard changes. If the change was not successfully implemented, the change should not be proposed as a standard change. Once the review has been completed, the change can be finally closed by clicking the Close button. This also ends the process. Before the change process is completed, it sends a final email to the applicant with the information as to whether the change has been successfully completed or not. If the change was proposed as the default, a new change template can be created on the Review tab using the Create Change Template button located there. The change type is automatically set to Standard Change and the status to Planned. The change process is also associated with the new change template. This makes it possible to trace which change led to the standard change at any time. The change template itself is automatically assigned to the change template group with the name change templates. The changes are planned and published on the basis of the approved changes. The change calendar informs everyone when and for how long a specific service will be unavailable for maintenance. The change calendar is available in the form of an SQL BI report.